Hello. Hello, Matt Gaspers from Catholic Family News. Great to see you.
Thank you, Bob. Good to see you today.
Well, we are talking today about one of the most important matters for a Christian, which is the memory of and the presence of Jesus Christ in the liturgy. And the liturgy is the supreme prayer of the church, and the supreme prayer of the liturgy is the Mass itself. And what we're discussing is how the Mass has been, how it was during the Second Vatican Council, and how it's been for the last 60 years.
Yes, a big topic. We'll do our best.
Yeah, so we ask our readers, not readers, our viewers to be attentive and yet also forgiving to us because the topic is massive and we're trying to present it to you in a fair, a clear, honest way as we hope to be faithful to the Catholic faith and to all of our forefathers and to our present leaders as they attempt to lead our church through what we all must agree is a difficult age of tremendous technological change, a kind of Promethean feeling of human beings becoming almost like gods. They can travel around the earth, although sometimes now the airplane doors are falling off.
My, haven't heard about that.
You haven't? Well, there's been about 8 incidents with Boeing aircraft in the past 8 days, to the point some people think that sabotage is occurring.
Yikes.
Yeah. In other words, the beautiful, complicated, scientific, somewhat troubling, sort of arrogant culture that we've created also
Mhm.
seems to be trembling now and perhaps on the verge of collapse. All the more reason to return to the faith.
Yes.
So, where do we begin, Matt?
Well, maybe just to recap for our viewers, and thank you to everyone who's watching live. Sorry we got a little bit of a late start today, but we appreciate your patience and we're glad that you're joining us. I see there's some people, want somebody from California in the live chat, and I think Arizona. So there we go. Good morning from California. Yep. So I think this is our fourth discussion on this topic, if I recall correctly. Oh, somebody says, listening from Arizona, good morning to Robert and Matt. Father Ripperger shared in a podcast that he uses a missal for the traditional Latin Mass from the 1940s. As he says, yes, before Bugnini got his paws on it. We are going to be discussing Annibale Bugnini today.
Yeah, this is the old Mass book right
Mhm.
here. Latin English booklet missal for praying the traditional Mass. And there's the priest and the
Yep.
crucifix. And it's got both the Latin and the English, Latin
Mhm.
on one side and English on the other.
Yes. So if I recall correctly, I think this is our fourth discussion on this topic. We started kind of the springboard was increased restrictions on the traditional Latin Mass. We looked at a recent example in the Diocese of Austin, Texas, where the Vatican has essentially said you need to shut down the traditional Mass that's been established going on for years now in the cathedral there. And also an address that Francis gave to the members of the Dicastery for Divine Worship in early February. I think it was February 8th, where he talked about, yep, there's the slide right there. Without liturgical reform, there is no reform of the church. And the heart of his address was basically celebrating Vatican II's constitution on the sacred liturgy, Sacrosanctum Concilium. So we've devoted quite a bit of time to going through that document and highlighting some very key quotes and the implications and the ramifications of those. Oh, I just saw somebody comment good afternoon from the UK. So we have an international audience now. And then I think last time we finished up discussing Sacrosanctum Concilium, and then we started getting into some opposition that was put up against the introduction of the new Mass with the Ottaviani intervention That's kind of its colloquial name. It's the formal name of it is the Brief Critical Study to the New Order of Mass, and it was introduced by a cover letter um, addressed to Pope Paul VI that was signed by Cardinals Ottaviani and Bacci. So we might get into a few more of those details today, time permitting. But I think today maybe we were going to talk about, so now that we're done discussing Sacrosanctum Concilium, which Paul VI promulgated at the council on December 4th, 1963. So what was the process between the end of 1963 and April, May of 1969 when he announced the new order of mass? Because there were several things that happened in between there, to kind of building up to that point. And we were also going to touch on, after we do that, we were going to touch on the accusations that Annibale Bugnini was perhaps a Freemason, and we have some actually an interview that Kevin Simmons conducted with Father Charles Murr. Your viewers are very familiar with, since you do a show with him on a regular basis. So the interview was from, I think, the fall of 2020, if I remember correctly, and Father Murr shares some of his basically firsthand details of the accusation and what he knows about it.
Well, I could go right to that if you want to begin there, or do you want to go first?
Um, Maybe we can hit a few highlights from kind of the timeline between Sacrosanctum Concilium and the introduction of the new mass, and then we can go into
All
more
right.
of the Bugnini stuff, if that sounds good to you.
Here's a Cardinal
Oh,
Bless Supich. This is a history of the council. This
yes.
is this is Father Ralph Wilkins' book. I knew Father Ralph. He visited
Hmm.
me and my father in our home and spent a day with us and confirmed to us that what he wrote about in this book was based on fact and not
Yes.
invented and not exaggerated. This is the purpose of the council to try to the council's document on the liturgy to try to reform the liturgy, which Pope Francis is looking back to. But of course, the point here in the time of the council and today in the time of Francis is that if he's told something wrong, or if the council was deceived in some way or told something wrong, or Paul VI was deceived in some way, we could argue, I think logically, that these changes were made under false pretenses, and we would have a better chance then of coming out to a reasonable and faithful conclusion.
Hmm.
So, and this is Marcel Lefebvre. He was at the council. He was a respected archbishop at the time.
Hmm.
And his dates are almost the exact dates of my own grandfather. He was
Oh,
born in
wow.
1905 and died in the 1980s. So my relationship to these events is the relationship of a grandchild, in a way, to remembering 20 or 30 or 40 years of the life of a grandfather. I was alive when Lefebvre was alive, and I was alive when I was a boy when the mass changed.
Hmm.
This is a biography. This is Bugnini and his long book where he does deny the allegation that he was a Freemason. But the allegation has been made, and made by many different people based
Hmm.
on certain evidence. And the evidence, of course, is contested. This is a biography, and this is the Ottaviani intervention.
Hmm.
What are we looking for here, Matt?
So if you wanted to just go back to the slide, I think the picture of Bugnini with Paul VI would be appropriate for some of this timeline discussion, because that they're the two of the major figures in all of this. Um, so as I
So,
mentioned, oh, go ahead.
well, I would say, look at Bugnini's dates, 1912 to 1982. So he died at the age of 70, the man on the left. He was a liturgist. He was an Italian. He was born in Umbria. He became a priest. He grew up in he was a child, a baby in the teens when the First World War was occurring. In the 1920s, Italy was extremely poor. The Vatican still hadn't become Vatican City State. The Pope was still locked in the Vatican. Italy was under Mussolini. Mussolini in 1922, when Bugnini was 10, and when Paul VI was 25, was taken over by Mussolini, who said, "This is the year one." He kind of almost was a religious figure that Italy was renewing its entire existence.
Mhm.
And in what we think of as Freemasonry had been involved under Garibaldi in uniting Italy and overcoming the impediment that they saw in the Papal States to Italy's reunification. So the nationalist Italians often were Freemasons. They didn't want the Papal States to continue. They didn't want the power of the church to continue. They felt it was against the unity of Italy. All
Mhm.
of these events were in the childhood and the young manhood of these two men. And then in 1929, Vatican City State was created with an agreement between Pius XI and Mussolini
Mhm.
in the Concordat, right in 1929. So that's
Yes.
only just 95 years ago.
Right.
Vatican City State is only 95 years old. And then the 1930s came, and already everything is obviously heading towards World War II. The Germans and the Italians are working together. There's the Axis is created, and tremendous poverty in the Depression in the United States. And the church is celebrating its Latin liturgy, and the world is heading toward war. And then after the war occurred, everything was devastated in Europe. Cities were bombed everywhere. The Vatican, Rome itself received a bombing, and I think 700 people were killed near
Mhm.
San Lorenzo. And Pius XII begged the Americans, don't bomb Rome. They were thinking of continuing to bomb Rome because Rome had been taken over by the Germans in
Mhm.
1943. So 45, the war ends. Americans flood into Italy. The Marshall Plan occurs. We rebuild Europe. The 1950s go by, and Pius XII sort of begins tentatively to reform the liturgy with changes in the Vigil Mass for Easter and changes for Holy Week, 1951 and 1955. And those were the years when I was born. And I was sort of introduced at the very end of the old Latin church and have a memory as a boy of those things.
Mhm.
And therefore, I too am a witness to these events. And then the council was called in 1959 by our dear friend uh, John the 23rd, who was elected at the end of 58, and already in January of 59, he announces, I'm going to call an ecumenical council, and we're going to open the church up after 400 years of Trent. And he said, we're going to throw open the windows of the church. We've been defensive. We're going to be now open and in dialogue, and we're going to engage the modern world. And everyone got very excited, and the Curia wasn't sure what to do, and they prepared some schema according to more traditional lines, but all over Germany and in other countries and in America too, they were thinking we can use this opportunity to modernize the church. And some things do always need to be modernized if you're stuck in a kind of situation where you're using old methods and old spending a lot of energy and a lot of drudgery. But other things don't need to be modernized, including the faith itself. So the tension between these things has been throughout my entire lifetime.
Mhm.
And we saw the pictures of Lefebvre throughout his lifetime. And all of us have experienced this. And Francis is still grappling with this, trying now to eliminate the old liturgy completely, which, as he regards it, as a sign of a kind of rigidity and scrupulosity. And I just wanted to add in this rambling introduction, this little book here. Let me show you this. Um, this is a diary from 1943.
Mhm.
of my father, William T. Moynihan, 1943. And he was in the seminary at the end of the Second World War. His brother was a Marine, and my dad became a Marine after the war. But what he was doing was trying to become a priest of God. And of course, my fate was my fate was determined by his decision. And in this passage here in his diary from those days, he was 17 years old. At the second page here at the bottom, he says, things change from day to day. He's out in Callicoon, New York in a seminary with about
Mhm.
200 other young men. I wonder sometimes how I will end my quest for holy orders. And
Mhm.
throughout the journal, he's saying, what is my vocation? What am I called to do? What is God's will for me? I hope that it will be successful, but the great fear of a mistake uh, dulls the enthusiasm a little.
Mm.
So you are looking into the soul of a 17-year-old who's thinking, I want to give everything up that's worldly and I want to become a priest of God. It's the highest thing. His parents had told him, his brother had told him, but he's wondering, will he be making a mistake? So he's trying to judge. And I look at it and think my own fate is being determined because 10 years later, I was born. He left the seminary, became a Marine. He met George C. Scott in his barracks, who became the actor who played Patton.
Mhm.
And they were friends. And then he became a student. He went on the GI Bill. He went to college at St. Bonaventure. And then he became a teacher, a high school teacher, then a college teacher. And he got married, and I was born. And
Mhm.
now I'm here in some way to carry on the things that he thought were important, but he did not become a priest. And the fact that why did I bring this up? Why is this extraneous material in? Because the idea of a priest of God, holy orders, which is throughout this journal, was so preeminent in the mind and heart of many young men. Were they suited to make this journey and to make this sacrifice to
Mhm.
to get and to represent Christ and in a sense to be Christ for the people, to sacrifice themselves. And then the key thing that they did was to celebrate the Mass. So, Matt, I think these matters are of supreme importance. That's why I want to talk about them. And
Absolutely.
I think you somehow have a sense of their importance as well, but you're not seeking any type of rabid, fanatical, or frothing at the mouth solution. You're trying to say, what is the mind of the church? And was there some deception or some enemy who crept in and distorted that mind? Isn't that the case?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. We want the health and we want Holy Mother Church, the mystical body of Christ, to be healthy and vigorous and vibrant, and um, not to continue suffering through what many people would characterize as, even Benedict XVI characterized as, a passion of the church. And he said those words specifically in reference to the third secret of Fatima. I guess maybe as a transition to talking about this process that we're going to, the timeline we're going to talk about, I think we have a slide. Since I brought up Fatima, we could bring this up. Cardinal Eugenio Pacelli, the future Pius XII, he's had some very startling words. He connected what he saw as a liturgical revolution, a theological revolution in the making. I think this was back in 1931 when he uttered these words. Here we go, and they are quoted. And I think my friend Christopher Ferrara may have been the one who actually discovered this quote. I think he's told me that, if I recall correctly. But as Bob will recall, this is the book that Archbishop Pietro Sambi recommended to you, The Secret Still Hidden. This is a detailed account of the the third secret of Fatima and all the controversy surrounding that. And
I
then,
should yeah, I should say, Matt, I appreciate you bringing that up, and you've mentioned it before, and I was fortunate to know Pietro Sambi, and
mhm,
I want to tell the viewers that he was a wonderful priest, a wonderful archbishop. I think he should have become a cardinal, and I think he was capable of being a wonderful pope.
mhm,
He was the nuncio in America. He had been in Israel as a nuncio, so he was a career Vatican diplomat. He came from San Marino
mhm,
in north central Italy, and he was cultured, and he was strong, and he was kind of jolly Italian,
mhm,
and
mhm,
he was very familiar with world affairs because he was a diplomat. He'd been in Israel, and then he came to the United States,
yes,
the most powerful country. And then he said to me one day when I was discussing some of these questions, he said, "I've been reading this book." And I said, "Well, don't you regard that as too far out?" He said, "No, no. Uh, they're raising interesting and important questions." And of
mhm,
course, I would say once again, Archbishop Vigano followed him
yes,
after. But why did he follow him? Because Sambi died. But why did
right,
Sambi die? He died because he went for an operation in Baltimore that was thought to be very simple. And then his family expected him to be out the next morning. And they said, "We're keeping him another day."
hmm,
And there were complications. And then he passed away.
yeah,
I think if Sambi had gone back to Rome, he would have been a figure. This was 2011 in
mhm,
the summer. And he would have gone back, and this is time of Vati leaks, the last 2 years of Pope Benedict. And if he'd gone back to Rome, where he was going to be in charge of Vatican finances, by the way,
okay,
he would have been made a cardinal, and I think he would have been a candidate to be the Pope. But
mhm,
somehow he passed away that summer. Vigano was then chosen. They moved Vigano out of Rome to come to America because that slot was open.
right.
Okay, so these are little side notes, but this is Pius the 12th here, who was
So
Pope.
this,
Yeah.
yeah. So, and the quote on the screen comes from this other book by Chris Ferrara called "False Friends of Fatima," which is another excellent resource.
And
So
you
just,
are your business really is Fatima Family News.
well, it's Catholic family news, but my predecessor, John Venari, God rest his soul, was always very much an apostle of Our Lady of Fatima and was very well read on the subject. So I try to carry on that legacy.
Okay.
Um, but this quote on the screen, just to give a little background, so that the Cardinal Eugenio Pacelli is pictured there. So he would be the future Pius XII. But he was actually, this quote was when he was the Secretary of State for the Vatican. He was also a career diplomat. He served in Germany and other places in the 20s and 30s under Pius XI. And in a conversation, which Chris Ferrara quotes in his book, he says, "I am worried by the Blessed Virgin's messages to little Lucia of Fatima. This persistence of Mary about the dangers which menace the church is a divine warning against the suicide of altering the faith in her liturgy, her theology, and her soul. I hear all around me innovators who wish to dismantle the sacred chapel, destroy the universal flame of the church, reject her ornaments, and make her feel remorse for her historical past." So, who is he talking about? Some of that is covered in this book available from Angelus Press called The Liturgical Movement from Dom Guéranger, who's pictured up in the corner here. I don't know if you can see it. Prosper Guéranger, the author of the Liturgical Year, very famous liturgical work, to Lambert Baudouin, who kind of, he was sort of a successor to Guéranger in some respects to in this liturgical movement, but he kind of took it in a unfortunate direction, more of a modernist direction. And then this on the bottom, of course, is Annibale Bugnini. So this is a helpful, it traces the history of the liturgical movement, which was started as a good thing in the mid to late 1800s with Dom Prosper Guéranger, was basically revitalizing the laity's interest in the liturgy and getting back to the the Roman tradition of Gregorian chant and things like that. It was not about updating things to make them more palatable to the modern world or stuff like that. Pope Saint Pius X endorsed it, and on its more traditional conservative track, but then unfortunately it kind of got off track in the 20s and 30s because it was the major players who took over the movement were very much more of a modernist bent, and that's something important to understand. This pre-conciliar, pre-Vatican II history is really about the war against modernism. As some of your viewers may know, for over a century and a half prior to Vatican II, the church, in particular the popes, had been engaged in a fierce battle against a mass of modern errors, which were gradually developed into a system and eventually became known as modernism, which St. Pius X famously condemned in Pascendi, the encyclical Pascendi, as the synthesis of all heresies.
And what is the essence of that really is a kind of materialism, we might say.
And
That
it's also a denial of basically absolute truth, and that the deposit of faith is something that comes from above, that God gives to man, is revealed. And according to the modernism, faith is something that kind of bubbles up from within human consciousness. It's not something that's revealed by God per se. So
yeah.
that's kind of the background to this quote. So that when he talks about, I hear all around me innovators, that's who he's talking about. He's talking about the liturgical movement, men like Baudouin and others who are fascinated by going back to the most their archaeologism that Pius XII ended up condemning in Mediator Dei, his encyclical on the liturgy in 1947, which was really written to try to correct um, the unhealthy innovations and eccentricities of the reformers in the liturgical movement. It was trying to salvage what was good in the movement and get, kind of excise what was bad. That was the purpose behind Mediator Dei. So anyway, this quote, if we could go back to that for just a second, I'll finish reading it. So it's interesting that he connects all of this to the message of Fatima, because none of what we've been shown as far as the text of the third part of the secret says anything about the items that he mentions, like the suicide of altering the faith in her liturgy, her theology, and her soul.
Hmm.
And he also went on to say, a day will come when the civilized world will deny its God, when the church will doubt as Peter doubted. She will
Hmm.
be tempted to believe that man has become God. You were
Hmm.
mentioning that in your introductory remarks, that we seem to be going through this Promethean
Well,
revolution, so to speak.
I'll say even more. This is that day, Matt.
Yeah,
It has come. We
right.
are living in it, and therefore the fight is at our gates, and we must stand. That's why we
Right.
started these podcasts. I was used to making a magazine. I'm not really an electronic or internet personality, but we're
Hmm.
going to learn how to do it. Go ahead.
And it's the prophetic nature of his remarks are so striking. He says, in our churches, Christians will search in vain for the red lamp where God awaits them. He's obviously talking about the sanctuary lamp, which was always, the tabernacle was always front and center on the high altar in churches, very easy to find. And in a lot of post Vatican II church buildings, our Lord has been banished to a corner or to a side altar or even to a separate chapel or something. And way back in 1931, he predicted all of this. Pacelli said, like Mary Magdalene weeping before the empty tomb, they will ask, where have they taken him? So,
Matt, this is so profound, and you've rightly pointed to this way before the council and even before the Second World War, that there was an anxiety that modernizing world that was reflected in the coming, really, already the film industry was starting, Hollywood was beginning, the culture was changing already, but
mhm,
that's just proceeded for another, it's really 75 years. It's exactly 70, 60. No, it's 85 years since he wrote that.
Mhm.
61 and 24, 85 years. And everything that he's written there has proceeded apace. And the central question, I guess, is reality. The central question is God. Is God real? The central question, a lot of the people who deny God say it's just a hope that human beings have, that there's a kind of father in the sky, and that the realistic person just sees atoms and nuclear energy and galaxies and human genetic code and leaves God out of the equation. That's why we
Mhm.
have a pragmatic, materialistic society, which is the kind of fruit of these modernist aspirations toward technology. And the track of these 85 years from 39 until today has been a rejection of the real presence of Christ. I mean,
Mhm.
you might say that's the key to it, that Christ is a story from 2,000 years ago, maybe even a doubtful story, but no longer relevant, no longer present. And the whole point of the faith, the Catholic Church, the mystical body of Christ, the Mass, the real presence of Christ in the Mass was to
Mhm.
make Christ present today, always, yesterday, today, forever, because he's
Mhm.
the answer, the real, holy, personal answer to all the aspirations of the human heart. But this has been gotten rid of step
Mhm.
by step. And the forgetfulness of Christ, the marginalizing of Christ, the removing of Christ is what I perceive as the consequence of this modernist movement. And I think this is what Pius senses is coming. But we do have a world without Christ any longer, and you have a world that can almost do anything. They can do experiments on embryos.
Mhm.
They can have what do we call it? Genocide. You can kill people by the thousands and the millions. There's no one stopping you if there is no God and there's no word of God who
Well,
is present.
a phrase that I like in this regard is we have two choices, either Christ or chaos, because our Lord Jesus Christ is the incarnate word. He is the logos, the reason. So if you reject Christ, you're rejecting reason itself, the divine logos.
Well, we see that we're going mad step by step, and people are defacing themselves and tormenting themselves and marking their faces and putting spikes in their heads. Um, so
And for most people, the most practical, but also what's meant to be a truly spiritually rich experience of our faith of the divine word is the sacred liturgy. So that's what it's, as we've talked about before, lex orandi, lex credendi. As I've said in an article in the past, the church's liturgy or her public worship and prayer shows forth and gives expression to the deposit of faith. And so you can't radically change the lex orandi and then expect nothing to change on the part of people's beliefs. That's simply um, not real, not reasonable. If you radically change how people are praying and introduce new concepts, it's going to have an effect on their faith. And I think that's what we've seen over the last 60 years or so.
I do have to take the moment to say it's important to me to say what were people doing after Christ rose from the dead? They gathered and they said, we're going to remember him and we're going to actually do what he did. Do this in memory of me. Remember, he said,
Hmm.
do this in memory of me. Break the bread. And it was a commemoration of the Last Supper. And therefore, it was a commemoration of the Passover meal, essentially, very fundamentally Jewish memory, a memory of um, the Exodus, in a sense, from the slavery of Egypt and the terrible events that surrounded that process.
Hmm.
And then it was also a memory of the sacrifice on the cross. So you have the Passover meal, which is a memorial of the Passover of the Jews out of Egypt. And you have the uh, the departure of Christ from his friends to be executed, the
Mhm.
sacrifice he offered on the cross, which in our faith we believe even one drop only of that blood was capable of saving all of the sins of our world, all the
Mhm.
fallenness, the frustration, the death, and the madness. It's the reason, and it's the healing, and it's the renewal of the universe because of his sacrificial death. They wanted to remember this in the Mass. What I'm trying to get at is, what was the Mass? The Mass was a memory of the Passover meal that he had on Holy Thursday when he said, "Do this in memory of me." It was therefore also a memory of the Exodus out of Egypt, because that's what the Passover meal was. It was
Right.
a memory of the crucifixion on Friday, when the King of the Jews was handed over, declared not acceptable, and a blasphemer. And the Roman just Pilate agreed, washing his hands, and his wife saying, "No, don't do it."
Right.
and it's
But I think
remembering.
also the in addition to memory, I think it's very important to emphasize that throughout the history of the church, if you were to sum up the mass in a single word, I think that word would definitely be sacrifice, because it is the sacrifice of Christ made present. It is the sacrifice of the new law, um, made present here for us to apply the infinite merits of Christ and his sacrifice on the cross in atonement for our sins and those of the whole world, as it says in the Divine Mercy Chaplet, for example.
Yes.
So very important to emphasize that as well. Which unfortunately, in the new rite of Mass, that reality of sacrifice, as Ottaviani and Bacci point out, and the brief critical study points out, has very much been downplayed. I wanted to read, since we're talking about the essence of the Mass, I also wanted to read something from the Council of Trent. This is from the decree on the sacrifice of the Mass, which helps us understand why the church the Mass has developed over the centuries in an organic way from being, the simple rites that our Lord did at the Last Supper. It's obviously become more elaborate over the centuries, and there's good reason for that. This is what the Council of Trent taught in the decree on the sacrifice of the Mass. And as human nature is such that it cannot easily raise itself up to the meditation of divine realities without external aids, Holy Mother Church has for that reason duly established certain rites, such as that some parts of the Mass should be said in quieter tones, and others in louder. And she has provided ceremonials such as mystical blessings, lights, incense, vestments, all of these things that were involved in Old Testament worship carried over into the New Testament, because our Lord came not to abolish but to fulfill. The text goes on to say, and many other rituals of that kind from apostolic order and tradition, by which the majesty of this great sacrifice is enhanced, and the minds of the faithful are aroused by those visible signs of religious devotion to contemplation of the high mysteries hidden in this sacrifice. That's the end of the quote. So it's very important for us to maintain the organic development of the sacred liturgy as it's developed under the guidance of the Holy Ghost, the Holy Spirit, throughout the centuries. And so I think that's definitely a very important to remember as well when we talk about the essence of the Mass, that we need those external, what the Council calls those external aids, in order to help us contemplate the mysteries of the Mass.
Absolutely. And this is not really a polemical position. We're not arguing for or against any person like Archbishop Bugnini or Pope John the 23rd or Paul the Sixth. No, or Francis or Pope Benedict. No, we are citing from an ecumenical council in the 1500s, the Council of Trent, which
Hmm.
is reflecting 1500 years of church tradition, and saying that our mass is important and holy for these reasons and has to do these things. And we are trying, as Catholics must do, keep what has been kept by our forefathers and
Hmm.
hand it down to our descendants. This is a completely legitimate process. In fact, it's essential and required. What you and I are doing must be done.
Mhm. Well, maybe I can give just a brief summary of this timeline of,
Okay.
so Sacrosanctum Concilium, Vatican II's Constitution on the Sacred Liturgy, was promulgated by Paul VI on December 4th, 1963. And I think that was the end of that session. Well, I guess it would have been the second session of the council. And then, not even a month later, in late January of 64, he issued what became the first document in this kind of succession of dominoes, so to speak, that led to the new order of Mass. So he issued, I think it was an apostolic letter, Sacram Liturgiam, in which he announced his plan to establish, quote, a special commission, referring to the concilium, whose principal task will be to implement in the best way possible the prescriptions of the Constitution on the Sacred Liturgy. So that was the purpose of that document. And then about a month later, in late February of 64, Paul VI actually established what the full title of the concilium is: Concilium for the Implementation of the Constitution on the Sacred Liturgy. He appointed Cardinal Lercaro as the president of this body and Father Annibale Bugnini as the secretary. And Bugnini, as we've discussed, has been very involved in these liturgical um, updates. You mentioned earlier the revisions of Holy Week and such during the reign of towards the end of Pius XII's reign. So he's been there for many years already at this point.
Yeah.
In September of 64, the concilium issued the instructions Inter Oeconomici on various changes, mostly concerning rubrics, which was based on Sacrosanctum Concilium. And these changes went into effect on March 7th, 1965, which, as you may recall, Bob, it was the first Sunday of Lent that year, and it was the date on which Paul VI celebrated the first vernacular mass at a parish in Rome. I don't know. I think there are photos of that floating around, but you may have seen before. So that was obviously a milestone event in this whole process. The first time that the mass was celebrated in this case in Italian at a parish in Rome. I forget the name of the parish.
Yep.
So from 64, and I think also during this period, as you can probably attest, I've only heard stories, but you might have seen some of this firsthand. There was really a lot of experimentation and just kind of ad-libbing going on during this period as well. I don't know how much, if you ever experienced that in the part of the country where you're from.
Yeah, I grew up in Connecticut, and I did see it was at a university, the University of Connecticut, which is
Hmm.
famous now for its basketball team.
Hmm.
And at UConn, there was a Thomas Aquinas chapel, and I remember clearly I was an altar boy there. And
Hmm.
I said this before, the priest at some time, I think maybe 65, came out without shoes on.
Oh my.
And I was sort of shaking, wondering, because we would put on our little vestment, the white surplice and the black cassock as altar
Hmm.
boys. And we were attempting to be servants and assistants. The server
Right.
we were called the server. And it seemed a break in the solemnity of the mass. I
Hmm.
was thinking, the king is coming. I have to act like a page in a court in some way. But
Right.
precisely there was what was desired to be changed. In fact, people in the liturgical movement were saying, well, too many things from the Middle Ages, from the kind of kingly courts and
Right.
page boys. No, no, we've got to be kind of one people. We've got to be democratic. All of these trends and tendencies, some of which were political, cultural, intellectual, some of which then went forward and verged on philosophical and then finally heretical ideas of modernism. All of these were bumbling around. And of course, right at that same time, the Beatles had come to America.
Mm.
and the whole culture was expanding with radio music, pop music, and
Mhm.
then finally the hippies were starting to wear pigtails and flowers, and so everything was changing. There was what we called the sexual revolution, and we can't forget that the pill was created right in the early 60s, which changed the dynamics of everything. And they wanted Paul VI to approve of artificial contraception and to change the role of a woman, in a sense, from a figure who was part of something to do with the next generation, with fertility, with having children, into something different from that. All of
Mhm.
these were vast and profound, enormous changes, which are pursuing from the late 60s all the way to today.
Mhm. So yeah, the last date that I mentioned on this timeline was in September of 64 with this instruction from the concilium affecting rubrics, and went into effect March 7th, 1965, when Paul VI celebrated the first vernacular mass at a parish in Rome. So yeah, about 2.5 years later, in May of 67, the concilium issued another instruction, this one called Tres ab hinc annos, which authorized priests to say the canon of the Mass aloud and in the vernacular, among other changes. Those were two of the major changes that were instituted. But up to this point, the the ordinary of the Mass, you held up that red Mass booklet earlier. The text of the Mass itself had not yet been changed. That's my understanding. But that was soon to change come October of 1967. By that point, the concilium had been working for what, about 2.5 years or so, from late February of 64 until October of 67. And it was in October of 67, during a meeting of the newly created Synod of Bishops that we hear so much about these days. I think it was one of their first meetings after the Vatican II. Father Bugnini presented his, what he called his normative mass, which was like the precursor to the new order of mass. He presented it to the bishops who were assembled in Rome for the synod, which he celebrated in Italian. And he did the same for a group of superiors general um, in December of 1967. And Archbishop or not Vegan, Archbishop Vigano, Archbishop Lefebvre was there for that, and he talks about it in the biography that Bishop Tissier, one of his subordinate spiritual sons, wrote. I have the book here. I just wanted to share with people what Archbishop Lefebvre, his reminiscing about that event. He said, so this is after witnessing what Bugnini called the normative mass in December of 1967. Lefebvre said, while listening to this conference, in other words, Bugnini's explanation of what he was doing, which lasted 1 hour, I said to myself, how on earth can this man be trusted by the Holy Father, referring to Bugnini? How can he have been the one chosen to reform the liturgy? We had before us a man who was trampling on the ancient liturgy offhandedly and with unimaginable scorn. I was shattered, and even though I find it easy to speak in such gatherings, as I had done at the council, I did not feel up to speaking. The words just stuck in my throat, because Archbishop Lefebvre had a deep love for the traditional Latin Mass. But he goes on to say, however, two superior generals stood up to speak. And I should have mentioned the reason why he was at this meeting is, in addition to being an archbishop, Lefebvre was also the superior general of the Holy Ghost Fathers at this time. So that's why he was there in the first place. So he goes on to say these other two superiors general stood up to speak. The first said, speaking to Bugnini, Father, if I understand rightly, now you've suppressed the confiteor and the offertory, shortened the canon, etc. A private mass is going to last 10 or 12 minutes. Father Bugnini replied, we can always add something. just unbelievable. So Lefebvre goes on, one could see what little importance he attached to the Mass in the way in which it was said. The second, a Benedictine abbot, spoke, this active participation, is it a corporal participation or a spiritual participation? And Lefebvre remarked it was the right question. Um, and this Benedictine abbot goes on, the normative Mass is meant to be attended by the faithful, but we Benedictines say Mass without the faithful being there in the monastery, obviously. What are we going to do now? And this was Bugnini's reply. To be honest, we haven't thought about that.
Hmm. Okay. So many things were not thought about, and many things were thought about. And we, like everybody else, can look back, study this history, and try to understand what happened. And that's what we're doing. And we're going to go right now to this question of Lefebvre said, how could Paul VI trust this man?
Mhm.
And because history is made by people, and they're made by St. Peter, and they were made by Judas, and,
Right.
and each of us has our part to play. And Bugnini had his part to play, and some people even support him. But there was a member of his commission, and we've got the remarks here somewhere on our slides, if I can find them.
Mhm.
Uh, well, it's hard to. We, we don't know about this question of was Bugnini a Mason. We'll come back to that later. There,
Okay.
we can investigate the evidence. This is the man I want to talk about. Father Louis Bouillet, 1913 to 2004. So he died 20
Mhm.
years ago. I did not meet and know him, but Father Joe Fessio, with whom I worked closely for many years, the Jesuit priest in San Francisco who founded Ignatius Press, was a
Mhm.
close friend and colleague of Father Louis Bouillet. So he's not a mystery. He's well known. He passed away. He was a French Lutheran minister who converted to Catholicism in 1939 when he was 26 years old, just
Mhm.
before the Second World War, from France. He then became a highly respected priest, a scholar of the liturgy, and an advisor at Vatican II. So
Mhm.
he's an acceptable, mainstream Catholic convert, educated, knowledgeable. His memoirs, the memoirs of Louis Bouillet, From Youth to Conversion to Vatican II, The Liturgical Reform, and After, were not published until 2014, 10 years ago. This is
Mhm.
another thing in history and in our analysis of things. We did not know generally and publicly what he said here until just a few years ago. And there may be things that we will learn now that still haven't yet been publicly known all these 60 years. But this is very
Mhm.
important. Why we're taking a moment here. This is what he said. Louis Bouillet worked with Bugnini for 3 straight years preparing the new mass. He was on the committee.
Right. The concilium, yes.
In 1974, Father Louis Bouillet recounted how he had tendered his resignation to Pope Paul VI. Maybe you want to read this?
Sure, I can do that. So this is in the memoirs, and the dialogue starts with Paul VI saying, "Father, you are an unquestionable and unquestioned authority by your deep knowledge of the Church's liturgy and tradition. I do not understand why you have sent me your resignation, whilst your presence is more than precious; it is indispensable."
Just 1 second. He was
Mhm.
there then from 65, 64, 65, a member of the commission. He stayed to 74. So he 10 years was working with Bugnini. Okay, go ahead.
Right. So Father Boyer responded, "Most Holy Father, if I am a specialist in this field, I tell you very simply that I resign because I do not agree with the reforms you are imposing. Why do you take no notice of the remarks we send you? And why do you do the opposite?"
Okay, evidently he's very rarely, if ever, spoken this long directly to Paul VI. This is one problem. The Pope has one or two channels that reach him. In this case, it was Bugnini telling the Pope everything. This is the first time Bouillet gets to explain to him. This is
Right.
one of the problems in the leadership of the Vatican. Go ahead. Next page.
Yes. So Paul VI responds to that by saying, "But I don't understand. I am not imposing anything. It is you who are sending me proposals. When Father Bugnini comes to see me, he says, here is what the experts are asking for. And as you are an expert in this matter, I accept your judgment. Father Bouillet, and meanwhile, when we have studied a question and have chosen what we can propose to you in conscience, Father Bugnini took our text and then said to us that having consulted you, quote, the Holy Father wants you to introduce these changes into the liturgy. And then Paul VI says, but not at all, Father. Believe me, Father Bugnini tells me exactly the contrary.
Hmm,
I never said that to Monsignor Bugnini. I
hmm.
was deceived. Father Bugnini deceived me and deceived you.
Okay, Matt, it's a critical moment here for everyone watching this. The Pope is saying he was deceived by the man who prepared the new mass for him. And the testimony, the witness comes from Bouillet from a personal meeting with Paul VI. He's written this, and this must be a fact that we calculate our understanding of these events from. And we've got well over 100 people on with us right now watching live, Matt.
Very good.
And then is there another page of this, or is that the end of it?
I think that is probably, I think that's the end of that.
That's the end of that.
Yeah.
So now, why would, okay, there's a spectrum of opinion about Bugnini, whether he was a somehow light-hearted or somehow, as we just said a minute ago, that he didn't think of certain things, to the other extreme, he thought of everything and he very carefully prepared everything. But for what purpose? Now, he did have critics who were his enemies, who, and Bouillet in another place says he was a man without culture and without honor. So
He
we
said that of himself.
no, Bouillet said that
Oh,
Bouillet,
okay. Bouillet
Bouillet,
said that. Okay.
this is Bouillet,
Yes.
died 10 years ago. Now we come to this question. Was Bugnini a Mason? I always begin this question and such questions by saying uh, Masonry in some ways is materialism. That is, it's uh, the belief in human brotherhood, but the elimination of the fatherhood of God. And therefore,
Yes. The
above,
brotherhood of man without the fatherhood of God.
yeah,
And
and
kind of
we,
a naturalism that you can basically become divine through this secret knowledge that the Masons claim to possess, essentially.
yeah, something like that. I think that's the way to understand it. What they want is meant to be free, to discover nuclear energy and genetic code and maybe make us live for 500 or 1,000 years. And they think the church, with its kind of mysticism and its belief in the holiness of God, will impede that process. Therefore, they want freedom and power.
Right. And on
Okay.
apps and the church's insistence on the natural law, the absolute immutability of moral laws, stuff like that.
So I think of it that way. Of course, there are different groups, and we talked about that in another podcast of groups of, or at least I did. I can't remember if you were on with me. We've been meeting again. The Catholic leadership has been meeting again with leading Freemasons in Italy.
Right.
But for people who are mystified, what does this mean? What could it mean? I like to say it's natural humanistic desire to be like God in some way.
Mhm.
And maybe I would be regarded as too simplistic, but many people won't understand what's the big deal about this. It's just a group of people gathered together with special handshakes and to help each other in business. But no, behind it is this radical desire for power and knowledge, which they somehow feel the church is impeding with its sort of traditional natural law, its worry about being holy, and therefore it has to be set aside and overcome.
Right. And Freemasonry has been, I forget how many different condemnations, but I think it's in the hundreds. I mean, the church
Yeah,
has been absolutely clear that the principles of Freemasonry are irreconcilable with the Catholic faith, with the true religion, which is the Catholic faith, and therefore no Catholic can be a Mason, basically.
Okay, so what do we have on this screen? Now, I for years was trying to understand the truth of this. There were reports already in the 60s that Bugnini was acting under instructions from others, that he had joined the Freemasons and had received instructions from their leaders to try to de-sanctify, to humanize the liturgy, and that that was actually his task.
Hmm.
And I kept asking people in Rome, is this? And they said, well, we don't know. There's no evidence. We're not sure. And finally, I found a high ranking archbishop who said, well, actually, Bob, you should know that they did find the briefcase.
Hmm.
And this man is now passed away, but I did have this conversation. And this man said that was a meeting in the early 1970s of the commission or of some committee in the Vatican, and Bugnini was present at the meeting. And there may be 15, 20, maybe 25 people in a big meeting room.
Right.
The meeting comes to an end, and one of the monsignors says goodbye to everyone. They go back out, and he looks around, and on one of the chairs, or next to one of the chairs, he finds a briefcase.
Hmm.
And he says, I wonder who left their briefcase. He said, I'll look inside. This archbishop said this briefcase was found. The man looked inside, and he found these two letters in the
Hmm.
briefcase. This was the origin of the story that Bugnini was actually a Freemason. The two letters, Buon is BU is the first two letters of Bugnini. An is the first two letters of Annibale. So in Freemasonry, often people join, they're given the joining number, and they're given the name, a shortage of the first, usually the first two letters of their first and last names, the last and first. Dear Buon, we communicate the task appointed to you by the Council of Brothers, in accordance with the Grand Master and the assistant princes to the throne. We oblige you to spread de-Christianization by confusing the rites and languages, and to set priests, bishops, and cardinals against each other. The Babel language or Babel language and ritual will be our victory, just as the single language and ritual was the strength of the church. Everything should take place in the period of 10 years, June 14th, 1964. Now, I'm going to just be very honest and say I do not know that this is an authentic letter, but it's on the internet. You can find it. Somebody found it, and this archbishop told me that the letter was found in the briefcase. But we still have this one problem. Could the letter have been planted there by an enemy of Bugnini? Could it have been a fake letter? I don't have the evidence that confirms this is an authentic letter that Bugnini actually received and that this was the case, that he worked in this way. But this is why there's a rumor and a whisper around the Vatican that was then told to me by a very reliable archbishop that Bugnini was a Freemason. There's the letter from Bugnini that was also found. And see, one wonders, why would he carry these letters in his briefcase? I mean, I wouldn't say we have 100% certainty that some trick didn't occur. Incomparable Grand Master, the desacralization is rapidly taking place. Another instruction was published, which took effect on June 29th. We can already sing victory because the vulgar language, the Vulgate, the vulgar language is the volgare in Italian. It means the modern language.
And that instruction that he mentions was probably the instruction tres ab hinc annos that I mentioned earlier, which authorized priests two things, among others, to say the canon of the Mass aloud and also in the vernacular. So I think that's probably what he's referring to there.
Okay, because the vulgar language, that is the vernacular language, the Italian and other English, etc., all the other language, is sovereign in the whole liturgy, including the essential parts, which in the conciliar document, it says the council wishes to keep Latin in the most essential parts. The greatest liberty, so they went against the council. The greatest liberty was given to choose between the various formularies to individual creativity and to chaos. Uh, b- okay. In short, with this document, I believe to have spread the principle of maximum licentiousness in accord with your wishes. Well, some people might say it's hard to believe that he really would have done that he would have believed such things, that he would have written such things. But next paragraph, I fought hard against my enemies from the congregation for the rights, and I had to use all my astuteness so that the Pope would approve it. By luck, we found the support of friends and brothers in Universalaus, International Association for the Study of Liturgical Music, who are faithful. I thank you for the funds sent. There's talking of a payment here, and I'm waiting to see you soon. I embrace you, your brother Buon. June 2nd, 1967. Now, again, if these are forgeries, then this is a terrible slander against Annibale Bugnini. On the other hand, we have just read this man saying that he met in 74, 7 years later, and finally quits, saying, Holy Father, I resign because I do not agree with the forms. Why do you take no notice of the remarks we send you? And Paul says, I didn't get any remarks. Bugnini comes to me and says, here is what they are asking for. Then Bouillet says, Father Bugnini took our text and said to us, having consulted you, the Holy Father wants you to introduce these changes. And then Paul VI says, not at all. Father, believe me. Father Bugnini tells me exactly the contrary. What we have here, I'm not saying for sure those letters are authentic, but what we have is evidence here from Bouillet of a personal conversation with Paul VI, telling him that all of the action of Bugnini was duplicitous, was tricky, was saying one thing to one group and saying the opposite thing to the Pope himself. So this, to me, raises a question, a serious question, a profound question, a question that needs an answer of whether we must regard the entire creation of the Novus Ordo Mass as flawed and due to deception and approved by Paul VI because he was told all the other advisors agreed. They thought it was great. And therefore he said, okay, I'll agree because I'm not a liturgist. There's a problem with the creation of the Novus Ordo that Bouillet points out in this conversation from 1974 when he resigned with Paul VI. That's my point.
And I know we're past the hour mark, so we'll probably have to start wrapping up. But one other thing I think we were going to mention, excuse me, was this interview that Father Charles Murr did with Kevin Simmons for your publication Inside the Vatican, because Father Murr, as your viewers probably know, was a personal friend of Cardinal Gagnon, who I think was in charge of, he was put in charge of this effort to do didn't Paul VI ask him to kind of
Yes.
investigate to see if the Curia was infested with Masons, essentially?
Yes. Okay. There's a couple of points here, and we are now getting to 150 live viewers, Matt. So we've got
Very good.
a small circle of people who are now a little more aware of some of these things, and I think we've got to hold the church together somehow based on reason and science and investigation. I think that's what Paul VI wanted Archbishop Gagnon to do. And yet there's so many cross currents that it's difficult to do that. So I hope people will pray for us. The situation is that I'm going to share my screen and give you this article. This is an article that we published in our magazine in
I think it was the fall of 2020. I think maybe September. I forget the September or October. I think it says at the bottom, but anyway.
So from Pius XII to Vatican II, the hidden history of a key church epic, but this was dealing with those years after the Second World War, and Father Charles Murr, in his interview concerning his book on Mother Pascalina Leinert, whom he knew well, unveils the mysteries of the people and events in the church in the mid-1900s. And this is nice work by Kevin Simmons, who was a seminarian for some years, and is quite a student of these questions. There's Pius XII with John the 23rd. There's Paul VI with John Paul II. Two different photos. This is all about Mother Pasqualina. Here's Father Charles Murr with Mother Pasqualina, and that was
she was kind of like wasn't she a godmother of sorts to him?
Yes.
I think, if I remember correctly. Yeah.
And here's Father Murr with Paul VI, a young priest from Minnesota, I believe, and Father Charles Murr with John Paul II. And he's watching all these events in the Vatican and talking with Father Archbishop Gagnon. This is Gagnon in this picture with Father Charles Murr when he's being ordained. And you call Mother Pascalina your godmother.
There it is.
And, yeah. And he talked about Gagnon. And this article can be found in Inside the Vatican magazine on our website. I guess I'll put the link in here.
Yeah, I think that'd be good in the
how can I
the
do
live
that?
chat, or we can put it in the live chat. But I think this is the part of the interview. If you scroll up just a hair, okay. So let's see. If you scroll down just a little bit. So let's see. Okay. Oh, just scroll up just a hair. There we go. So Mr. Simmons asked Father Murr, you mentioned earlier that you knew Cardinal Gagnon. Please tell us a little about him. And Father Murr says, Edouard Cardinal Gagnon was born and raised in Montreal, Canada. He entered the Sulpicians and trained to become a seminary professor of philosophy and theology. He was also a canon lawyer. Gagnon was a very intelligent, extremely hardworking, and seriously pious and prayerful man with a great sense of humor. He had a good voice and loved music. He loved everything about Colombia.
He became a missionary in Colombia and a teacher in a seminary there.
Right. He was appointed rector of the Canadian College in the early 1970s and was soon asked by Pope Paul VI to act as a consultant on various church matters.
Canadian College in Rome. He was called back to Rome, right.
So this is where Father Murr starts getting into the investigation in the Curia that I mentioned earlier. So Simmons asks, was there a particular project that Gagnon worked on for the Vatican? And Murr says, yes, he was working on a full-time investigation, a papal visitation of the Roman Curia at the behest of Pope Paul VI. I lived next door to Gagnon for nearly 2 years at the Lebanese residence for priests in Monteverde Vecchio, a stone's throw from the Janiculum.
But and that's where I live in Rome as well. I'm about 100 yards from where they were. Well,
very good.
Maybe 200 or 300 yards. Okay.
So he talks about, that he lived with Mario Marini and Gagnon in the fall of 1977. And then skipping down a little bit, it says, so Father Murr published a book, I think in 2017, about Mother Pasqualina. There we go, called The Godmother.
Right.
So Simmons says the Godmother goes into some detail about the papal visitation. Was this the visit? What was this visitation about? For context. And Father Murr explains, a papal visitation, more properly an apostolic visitation, is an official investigation of a situation or of an individual, a group of individuals, or of an entire institution, conducted in the Pope's own name by the Pope's personally chosen and appointed representative. This representative of the Pope is called an apostolic visitor. When we speak of the Roman Curia, we are referring to those mostly prelates and clerics who make up the central government of the Catholic Church with offices in or near the Vatican. In 1975, toward the end of his pontificate, Paul VI seemed convinced, finally and thoroughly, of what he himself declared in 1972 in St. Peter's Basilica, that, quote, the smoke of Satan had entered the church. Some of the most high-ranking members of the College of Cardinals, the Pope's closest advisors, had gone to him personally and leveled some very damning accusations against key members of his own central government, that is, the Roman Curia. Very damning accusations, Father Murr emphasizes, the consequences of which are still with us today. It really shook the Pope. And so here's where it gets to involving Father Bugnini.
Okay, so what we do know is that right at this time, the Pope was informed of the allegations of these documents that he had been a Freemason. And whether or not he believed it, we don't know that for sure. But what we do know is he fired Bugnini. That we know. After Bugnini from 1948 to 58 to 68 to 74, so that's 12, 22,
A long time.
26 years. 26 years he'd been the kind of key figure in the liturgical reform. In 1974, after 26 years, he was fired and sent to Iran, where there's about 15 Catholics, and became the nuncio in Iran. Some people say it was a promotion, but almost everyone says he was promoted in order to remove him.
Right.
And Paul VI changed his relationship to Bugnini, who didn't really want to go to Iran. And clearly something changed in his life and in the relationship between him and Paul. And Bugnini says that in his own book. He said, Paul VI would not speak to me and explain his decision. Okay, so something changed. That's for
Yes.
sure. Who were the cardinals who made these accusations?
Yes, so that's the question, and Father Murr answers Cardinals Dino Staffa, Silvio Odi, and Archbishop Giovanni Benelli. Those were the three he mentioned. Staffa was a very powerful Curia official. At the time, he was prefect of the Apostolic Signatura, more or less the Chief Justice of Catholicism's Supreme Court. Silvio Cardinal Odi was another powerhouse. He later became the prefect of the Congregation for the Clergy in 1979. So Kevin Simmons next asks Father, the godmother, his Father Murr's book seems to record some information about these accusations. For instance, you state that Mother Pascalina Leonhardt believed, sorry if I mispronounced that, believed Archbishop Annibale Bugnini was a Freemason. Bugnini was the secretary of the concilium, arguably the key person tasked with implementing the liturgical reforms. Could you tell us a little about why she believed this? And Father Murr responded, Bugnini stood seriously accused by Staffa, Odi, and Benelli of being a Freemason and carrying out Freemasonic designs against the Church. Bishop Gagnon and Don Mario Marini also knew about the matter. For her part, Mother Pascalina, as with most of the older and wiser personages I knew, was on the Vatican's inside track. She was close to Cardinals Ottaviani, Siri, Spellman, and to Archbishop Fulton Sheen, etc., as well as to many others around the world and in the Roman Curia. She knew Montini, Paul VI, very well and deeply mistrusted him. I believe, but I couldn't swear to it, that she suspected Montini of being a Bugnini promoter and defender even before Pius XII died. But anyway, regarding Bugnini himself, not until sometime after the Second Vatican Council did people start waking up to what Bugnini was doing and then to what Bugnini was. Nothing of any consequence was mentioned about Monsignor Bugnini until the mid-1960s. Only after Pius XII's death and John XXIII's did Bugnini show his true colors. He was flying under the radar, in other words. When Paul VI made him a bishop in 1972, people knew or thought they knew that he was in the Curia to stay. And then Mr. Simmons says, Father Murr, if Archbishop Bugnini was somehow involved with Freemasonry, what can we say then about Bugnini and the conciliar liturgical reforms? And this, I think, is a key statement from Father Murr on this whole matter. He says, I think it is better to ask whether Freemasonic designs had something to do with the liturgical reforms that Bugnini decided the Second Vatican Council desired. Were Bugnini's reforms concerned with a more perfect adoration and worship of God, or with celebrating the Freemasonic concept of the brotherhood of man? That is a crucial point that Father Murr makes right there. He goes on to say, when certain council fathers insisted that not one word of the 1600-year-old Roman canon be touched by any stretch of the imagination, could that be taken to mean they wanted to concoct entirely new canons? And he also says, when Archbishop Carlo Maria Vigano recently suggested that the Second Vatican Council be reconsidered, that's his word, I sighed in full agreement. And I'm pretty sure Father Murr was referring to I think it was Archbishop Vigano's first major text on the Second Vatican Council, which came out in June of 2000, if I remember correctly.
Hmm.
So,
Well, there's a long evolution in many of these matters, and Archbishop Vigano has had his evolution. Uh, Remember, everybody is tendency is to be a normalcy bias, we might call it, whether it's regard to our government or our medical authorities. And in the church, many young seminarians, young priests, many people who go to work in the Vatican, they are so idealistic. And I would say Archbishop Vigano was that man. And he very much supported everything that John Paul II, he was working closely under him, was doing, even though he raised his eyebrows at time. And he told me personally that when they had the meeting in Assisi, he said, we looked at each other and said, what is John Paul thinking? And
yes.
only in more recent years, I mean, he always celebrated the Novus Ordo Mass. And only in more recent years, as we began to discuss these questions, did he start to wonder whether there was more and deeper concern with regard to some aspects of the conciliar liturgical reform and then even to the council itself. And the key point here, however, I would emphasize, the council was a pastoral council. Therefore, we don't have to imagine that we're overthrowing a teaching of the council. We can say there was an unwise or ambiguous insertion into the text of the Second Vatican Council, but nothing, by definition, affected the dogmatic teaching of the church, because from the very beginning they said what we're doing at the council is presenting the already established church teaching, which is all true, is all agreed upon. We're just trying to be more effective in presenting it to the modern world. So I do not see the possibility of attacking the authority of a council by investigating the ambiguities of the conciliar texts. In any case, go ahead then, maybe.
Oh, I was just going to share real quick since we were talking about Vigano. I don't know if I ever shared this with you. I'm going to send you a link in the private chat. This is I reviewed your book Finding Vigano a few years ago. So I wanted to share a link. I did the review for Catholic Family News. It's available on our website. So if you're interested in sharing that in the live chat so people can find it, but I gave you a very glowing review of that book. It was very good work on your part and also on the part of Archbishop Vigano. So
So put this up.
if folks want to learn more about your book, it's been out. You published that, I think, in the fall of
Fall of
2020, right? I think
Yes,
so. Yeah,
I handed it in September and it was out in November.
that's right.
And
So
remember, everything continued to change all those months of the COVID. That was 2020 was the virus. So, and then 2021 was the vaccine. And then
yes,
2022 was the war in Ukraine.
yes.
So I determined those 3 years. And then 2023, we've been kind of in a kind of no man's land. And now 2024, we're heading to all sorts of conclusions in all of these matters. And I'm very carefully trying to follow what exactly is the truth of all of these things.
Now I do have a quick question for you that I've been wondering for a while. So you mentioned, I think at the end of the book, Finding Vigano, or somewhere in there, I don't remember the page, but there was mention of a second volume of a kind of a continuation of that discussion. Is that still in the works?
I have to be honest, I almost passed away writing that book.
Oh my,
Well, I
I
don't
was
think
not aware of that.
I became so under pressure because I was told by many people, including high-ranking Vatican authorities, do not do anything with Vigano.
Mm,
And then I told Vigano, I'm going to present you to the world in my book. So I
mhm,
didn't agree with what I was told in the Vatican. But I thought, am I betraying? A Catholic must follow, at least notionally, be a faithful servant of his superior authorities in order to carry out the mission of the church in the world.
mhm,
Deeply embedded in our faith is the virtue of obedience. But Paul, St. Paul, and many others, and of course, even a principle in Protestantism, which
mhm.
is to obey God, not man.
Right.
But I started to lose weight by March or April of that year. I don't think it
Mhm.
was related to the virus, and I just was under stress every day. And by normally I weigh about 175 pounds, and I was 131 pounds.
Oh my.
And I was as skinny as I had been when I was about 13 years old.
Wow.
And I had no strength. And then I finished the book and I said, I've got to get in better health and continue. But I think it was the stress. And my
Mhm.
editor, John Morehouse, my dear friend John Morehouse, said to me in December, he said, we just got the copies, and I'm telling my wife I'm going to take a few days off for the first time in a year because I've been working on you
Yeah, I
with you
remember this. Yep.
even on the weekend. She says, we're going to go out this weekend together, my wife Robin and I, John
Mhm.
Morehouse, with 5 children. He was 51 years old. And that night he had a massive heart attack and passed away.
God
John
rest his soul.
Morehouse, John Morehouse, I think, was also suffering from the pressure of doing a book that the Vatican and the Pope felt was for someone who was too critically attacking the actions of the papacy and the actions of a group in the church who are kind of brotherhood who occasionally will cover up corruption.
Mhm.
Both of us suffered, and John paid the highest price. He passed away. And I then started to think, what else can I do? And it wasn't long after that that we started thinking of podcasts.
Mhm.
And I, in some way, have to reposition myself as an aging man in a young person's world. And
Mhm.
I'm trying to learn how even to move the pictures around on this platform. And you, I appreciate very much, Matt, because you're very organized. And I think, I don't know, do viewers find what we're doing of any interest? Maybe we could have a couple of comments before we close.
Yeah, that would be good.
Is it important to do what we're doing? And what else would you like to see us take a look at? But the essential thing now is to return to Christ and the Logos and to the Catholic faith and to try to help the church rebalance, not with a fanatical attitude, but with a loving, filial attitude, because everyone has been deceived, Matt, including
Mhm.
popes themselves.
Right. Maybe we could wrap up by saying something about, I see some people chiming in now, most important and interesting. Thank you, Kathleen. And someone else said very interesting. Thank you. Thank you, Anne, for that. Maybe we could go back, because I know we have focused on this passage before, but in the slideshow, I'll see if I can find the number. I think it should be slide number 10. If you still have the slideshow available, maybe we can return to this quote. See some other people commenting. Kathleen says there are a number of outside influences that deserve some attention. Marshall Kinsey says it's absolutely important that you do what you're doing. Thank you so much. Forgive me if I mispronounced the name. Uh, Ethna Murphy. Absolutely. Very good.
Thank
So
you, Esther.
thank you so much for all of your positive feedback. We greatly
Oh,
appreciate that.
our videos are brilliant and very informative. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. Here we go. We as faithful Catholics need to hear the truth about what happened. Thank you for what you do. Yes, sometimes the truth can be unpleasant, but it is the truth that sets us free, as our Lord tells us in the gospel. So we need to know the truth of what happened.
Okay.
Um,
Lucia, please continue with these conversations. All right.
so this quote, I know we've covered it before, but this is like the seminal quote for the entire council. It's the first paragraph in Sacrosanctum Concilium, and it lays out what the council fathers allegedly wanted to do through this council. Although we do have to remember that the document or the Constitution on the Sacred Liturgy, Bugnini had a hand in writing this document as well, as did some other progressives, like progressives of the liturgical movement. It was the only schema that survived the trashing of the rest of the preparatory work. So we do have to keep that in mind. Nevertheless, the Council Fathers did overwhelmingly vote in favor of it, and Paul VI promulgated it, so it is what it is. But anyway, this is how the document starts. It says, "This sacred council has several aims in view. It desires, so number one, to impart an ever increasing vigor to the Christian life of the faithful. So first of all, it's concerned with internal matters. Um, Number two, to adapt more suitably to the needs of our own times those institutions which are subject to change. Number three, to foster whatever can promote union among all who believe in Christ. So there's an ecumenical intention or dimension to all of this. And then it also goes on to say whatever can, I don't think we have this quote up on the screen, unfortunately, but it talks about whatever we can do to bring all of humanity into the church. So those are the four intentions or aims of the council. And I guess what I would argue in closing, as we're discussing this liturgical matter, all of these points are covered by the traditional Latin Mass in traditional Latin Mass communities. You see at traditional Mass parishes an ever increasing vigor to the Christian life of the faithful. It's very evident. There's the documentary Mass of the Ages just released their episode 3, and they document how the Latin Mass communities are thriving. They're bursting at the seams with young families who are on fire with the faith. So the traditional Mass does that.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, actually, I'm going to be in Rome for Easter, and I expect to have the chance to get close to Pope Francis if I
mhm,
possibly can get a few moments. But in any case, I intend to leave a note for him. And I'm going to say, I think what happened with his Traditionis Custodes was the same thing that happened with Paul VI and Bugnini. He was told certain things that he believed about these traditional communities.
mhm,
And I think he's been misinformed. I think that is the precise way that we could have just in the very final months of this present Pope's life, a change even in his decision. But that is a matter of my ideal hope. I
mhm.
hope it's possible. I'm going to try.
Yes, that would be wonderful. I was just also going to say that, contrary to some people's opinions, the kind of the more progressive modernist opinions, the traditional Latin Mass has a profound missionary efficacy, a power to draw non-Catholics into the church, whether they're non-Catholic Christians or even non-Christians, as Archbishop Lefebvre testified when he was a missionary in Africa for many years prior to the council. Um, the native African peoples who converted to the faith, who entered the church, they loved the traditional Latin Mass. They would sing the chants in Latin and all of that. And even today, I think I may have told this story before, but my friend Chris Ferrara, he's told me that his wife, I'm pretty sure she grew up Protestant. I forget which denomination, but she attended a traditional Latin Mass with him, and she was just stunned by the beauty and awe and the transcendence of God. And her reaction was, "This is serious worship. This is serious business." And it's actually what drew her into the church to become Catholic. So the missionary power, the power to convert souls, is very much in the traditional Latin Mass. All of those aims of the council are pretty much there. I mean, we just need to let the mass be the mass and not try to water it down or make it more palatable to certain progressive worldly mindedness kind of thing. We just need to let the mass be the mass and to celebrate it with reverence and love for our Lord, and God will communicate the graces through it.
Matt, do you see this note?
I do, yes. Oh, that's very providential. Today, yep, the feast of Pope St. Gregory the First.
And 590 to 604, Gregorian chant, because his name was Gregory.
Mm-hmm.
He wrote the life of St. Benedict, who had lived from 480 to 549. And Gregory was sort of the hinge at the end of the Roman period as we head into the Middle Ages. And they say he codified more or less the Mass as it was again codified in Trent at the Tridentine Mass by
Yes.
Paul V, Paul V, and therefore we believe the Mass doesn't just go from Trent to 1960s, but from Gregory the First to the 1960s. So we regard it really as 1,300 years, and we believe that Gregory codified it on the basis of the previous 550 years, the 5 centuries from the apostolic age up to his time. So
Yes.
certainly there was development, but we regard the Tridentine Mass as a organic emanation of the early church fathers, and that therefore it was continued to our time and then abruptly departed from, even as Pope Benedict told us, by the committee around Archbishop Bugnini, who presented it to Paul VI and said, this is what everyone wants.
Yes, it is truly the traditional Latin Mass, the Tridentine Mass, the one that was canonized, codified by Pope St. Pius V in 1570, is, as he said in Quo Primum,
Pius V, yeah.
or excuse me, Pius V.
Yeah.
What did he say? He said it was what he did with his liturgical commission following the Council of Trent was to restore the traditional Roman rite according to the custom and rite of the Holy Fathers, meaning the Church Fathers. That's what he says in Quo Primum. So it's a restoration and codification of the ancient Roman liturgy. It is the authentic Roman rite.
All right. I think you've said it all there, Matt.
Well, yes, we're probably better leave it there for now. We've been going on for a while, but thank you so much to everybody who's watched. And I saw somebody.
We had this question here.
Yeah, I was going to mention that. 107 viewers and only 62 likes. Yes,
Well,
please like.
It's 155 right now, Matt.
Okay, so yeah, everybody watching to help what is it called? The algorithms, I guess, YouTube algorithms, to show that this is a good video. Please like the video and share with your family and friends. Share it on social media to spread the word. Make sure to subscribe to the channel and
Which
click
doesn't
the
cost anything.
correct.
And you can unsubscribe if you don't like us.
Yes. And click the notification bell so you're notified every time that Bob goes live. I also invite you to check out Catholic Family News, our YouTube channel, and check out our content over there. Just subscribe to our channel. Same thing. It doesn't cost anything. It's just the click of a button. But
and where are you, Catholic Family News? Where is that?
Like, where are we based? Do you mean?
Both physically and on the internet.
Right. So we have our headquarters basically is in just across the border in Canada from upstate New York. Is kind of our headquarters, but we also have a lot of operations in the United States as well. The paper is published like physically printed in Canada, but we have a lot of subscribers in the United States. And then so our website is catholicfamilynews.com.
Okay.
And as I said, we're also on YouTube as well as on Rumble, which is kind of an alternative to YouTube. They seem to be less about censorship over there. Sometimes YouTube can be problematic in that regard, depending on what you're discussing. So that's where to find us. And as Bob, I'm sure, would agree, we definitely need everybody's support, also in the form of a paid subscription to our monthly publications, which is vital for our operations. Inside the Vatican magazine and Catholic Family News. Very good resources where we go into greater depth and scholarly detail in our articles, more so than we're able to do on a podcast. So please consider subscribing to those.
Thank you very much, Matt. Thanks to all those of you who have taken the time to join us. See you next week.
God bless you.